Chapter 176, EP 33, Reading Again, 7. I nodded and opened my mouth. Still, don't kill her. We must beat her. That woman has no intention of cooperating. I glanced at my blood-soaked mother. I didn't know if it was her blood or the blood of others. However, she was obviously at her limits. She had somehow been fighting with a reasonable probability, but her physical strength must have bottomed out. It was an inevitable result. She was alone and this place had Yu Junghyuk. Yu Junghyuk had become transcendent and was on a completely different dimension compared to Peace Land. No matter how great the story, it was impossible with just a shadow. It wouldn't be easy to overcome a transcendent unless one part of the body descended, but my mother didn't have enough probability remaining. The constellation, demon-like judge of fire, is gulping. The constellation, prisoner of the golden headband, is paying attention to your choice. The constellation, abyssal black flame dragon, is observing your atrocious acts. I left my party members and headed towards my mother. Stop trying. The fourth wall is shaking faintly. Why are you stopping me? My mother's face didn't look good, despite it being barely visible through the shadow of the constellation. Only her eyes and mouth were barely revealed. It was a distance that could be crossed, but I could never reach her. It was the same in prison and even now. This had become our distance. She told me, if I talk, you won't listen. This person, why was she going so far? Why did she keep doing this despite her bloody body? My companions were watching me. Their eyes were asking me to make the right choice. I sighed and opened my mouth. Just once. I will listen just once, so tell me. I was surprised by the words that came out of my mouth. Tell me the story properly. I didn't know I could say this. I squeezed out these words even though I didn't know if I was sincere or not. My mother's eyes shook. How long can you stay like this? Don't keep it to yourself and tell me. Why are you blocking me? Mother, why did you come all the way here? Anything, saying anything is fine. If I say it. I saw the eyes that seemed like they would cry and realized all the stories so far had been connected. I was her child, so I knew. The reason my mother blocked me was related to why my mother wrote the essay. I would be hurt. I would break. My previous life might be ruined. Tell me. I had long thought about it. Perhaps it was the story I had already predicted. There were so many hints from the constellations that it would be odd if I didn't know. Nevertheless, I wanted to hear the story directly from my mother's mouth. It might completely change my life, but I had to listen, even if the wall shook again. It was because it was my story. Some stories couldn't be understood if I missed a page. Soon, my mother's lips opened. However, in this damn scenario, it wasn't a story just involving mother and son. The nebula Vedas is looking at your fate. The nebula Olympus is looking at your fate. The nebula Papyrus is looking at your fate. A new drama wasn't allowed for us. The nebula's messages popped up and intense sparks filled the air. My mother grabbed her head with both hands and started to scream. I yelled and ran towards her. The moment my outstretched hand was about to reach my mother, the shadow of Founder's mother caught me. Constellation Kim Dokja. You can't pass here. There was a crack on the 8-beaded bell and black, muddy waves overflowed. There was a fierce sound like the sky was being ripped apart, and a vortex appeared in the sky. A portal was opening at the center of the vortex. The Great Hole. The excessive probability had summoned a being who would destroy everything. Everyone, don't look at it. Close your eyes. I shouted the moment I discovered the tentacles coming from the hall. I didn't know about Yu Junghyuk, who was a transcendent, but ordinary incarnations would collapse just from seeing such an existence. An outer god. Yu Junghyuk's expression hardened. We were convinced when we saw the tentacles coming from the great hole. This was an outer god. A god who was called due to the sacrifice of Founder's mother. Thunder fell from the crack in the sky while the distorted time and space screamed painfully. It was similar but different to when that guy was summoned on Peace Land. The one being summoned now was the true body of an outer god. Based on this scale, at least 1/3 of the true body would be summoned. The true body of a god. The shadow couldn't even be compared to it. Yu Junghyuk. If we don't stop it now, it is too late. It isn't a level I can stop. My body was trembling just looking at the sky. I could see it with the status of a constellation. The fourth wall is strongly activated. My trembling subsided a bit by fourth wall, but the fear didn't change. The existence beyond that great hole was something that couldn't be beaten even if the present Yu Junghyuk and I combined strength. In the midst of this helplessness, I realized something. Now it wasn't a fight for incarnations. Some of the incarnations with historical-grade constellations shed blood and died the moment they saw this existence. Yu Junghyuk and I protected the party members and retreated. Yu Junghyuk's eyes were becoming darker. I spoke in resistance. Don't worry. The constellations won't stay quiet once this type of guy descends. It was shown at the constellation banquet that the constellations and the outer gods didn't have a good relationship. In a situation where the god descended, no other constellations would intervene. The great sage, Heaven's equal, Uriel, and the slightly reliable black flame dragon. However, the constellations showed no response to the true body of the god passing through. Yu Junghyuk spoke through gritted teeth. I don't know how they can be ignorant. It was a confusing situation for me as well. This was the descent of an outer god. Why wasn't anyone coming to help us? Some constellations are astonished by the coming of the outer god. Many constellations are complaining about the tyranny of some nebulae. What? The constellation Prisoner of the Golden Headband is showing hostility to the nebula Papyrus. The constellation Abyssal Black Flame Dragon is baring his fangs to the nebula Vedas. The constellation Demon-like Judge of Fire resents the atrocious acts of the nebula Olympus. Now I realized. I see. This damn situation. All constellation on the Korean peninsula are wondering which nebula you will choose. This was all happening because of me. The messages popped up in turn. A number of nebulae want you to inherit their stories. If you inherit a story, your existence will be forcibly bound to the nebula. The nebula Olympus wants you to inherit Carnival of Lightning. The nebula Olympus wants you to inherit Thunder Guide. The nebula Papyrus wants you to inherit Master of the Typhoon Wolf. The nebulae are offering you a final choice. All the constellations on the Korean peninsula are watching your choice. I laughed. This was why I didn't like the constellations. Carnival of Lightning. Thunder Guide. Master of the Typhoon Wolf. They were all stories of constellations with histories of killing their own relatives. At the same time, each nebula had a powerful story. Perhaps if I succeeded their stories, I would be able to repel the outer god. Then my mother would die here. Yu Junghyuk was watching me. His eyes asked what I was going to do. I said to him, Yu Junghyuk. Do you remember the nebula we made? Kim Dokja's company. It wasn't simply to save my mother. Everything would end if I belonged to a nebula. There was no way I could overcome the unfair contract with them, and I would never be able to reach the end of the story. You still want to use that name? Yu Junghyuk frowned as he moved close to me and pulled out a sword. I will choose the name of the nebula. I smiled at the thought that Yu Junghyuk was joking. The energy of transcendence could be felt by my side. It was strangely relieving despite the presence of a person who had long surpassed my scale. It might be because I felt like we were standing on the same horizon for the first time since the scenario began. I declared towards the stars in the night sky. I won't bow to your fate. I pointed my sword towards those silent gazes. I will decide my story. Then I heard a laugh come from somewhere. Along with the laughing sound, I heard a whisper from the universe that seemed to be mocking these insignificant worms. Unfortunate constellation. You who killed your father with your own hands. You who will destroy your mother. You who will see the downfall of your precious things. I stared at the outer god. If he finished his descent, the second floor of Dark Castle would be completely erased. It was a different situation from Peace Land. There was no place to go if a crisis happened here. However, inside me was a constellation who was as weary of the word fate as I was. A few hundred years have passed and things haven't changed. Damn son of a bitch. Chiak Jungyang's presence inside me started to be released. I didn't know if it was possible for Chiak Jungyang to cope with the god from another world. Still, I had no choice but to believe in him. Chiak Jungyang shouted towards Founder's mother, who was half-eaten by the god from another world. Founder's mother. Why did you make a deal with the outer god? It was a deep and resonant voice filled with anger. Since when did Hongik become so cheap? Surprisingly, the Founder's mother replied. I didn't make a deal with the outer god. Then what is this situation? I'm sorry. There was no other way to protect the scenarios of the Korean peninsula. This incarnation should be here. That man shouldn't return to the Korean peninsula. Otherwise, the other nebulae. Did you make a deal with the nebulae? Chiak Jungyang exclaimed. Are you still so obsessed with that little land that you are now betraying your descendants? You don't know. You. What the hell is this? Where is the creation god? Why is he invisible when something like this is happening? The creation god. However, the words of Founder's mother didn't finish. The next moment, I felt Chiak Jungyang looking towards the sky. Don't tell me. The night sky sent an indirect message before answering. The nebulae declares that anyone who helps Goryo's first sword will be regarded as their enemy in the future. Then like magic, the indirect messages in the night sky became calm. I heard the voices of the great sage, Heaven's Equal and Uriel, but they seemed unable to intervene due to their own interests or special reasons. Chiak Jungyang gazed at the night sky through my eyes. I could feel the explosive emotions mixed in the silence. Chiak Jungyang's rage and sadness. His grief. And his decision. You can feel proud. Chiak Jungyang spoke to me. Those who are at the highest point in this damn world are afraid of you. What is pride worth when I am going to die? You won't die. They were just words, but they were words spoken by a constellation. As if putting a buoy against fate, all the stories built by Chiak Jungyang were rooted in my existence. I won't let you die. Chapter 177, EP 33, Reading Again, 8. Chiak Jungyang's story filled my whole body, while the stories of Chiak Jungyang scattered through the star stream started to gather. It was a good story that improved the status of existence just by reading. The story Dragon's Blood has become known. The story Wiping Out an Army with One Sword has become known. The story Battlefield Slaughterer has become known. He was a strong man from birth. He was born with a dragon's bloodline. Chiak Jungyang. Chiak Jungyang has appeared. He cut 36 enemies alone. From the time of Chiak Jungyang's birth until now. He didn't know about the scenario, but he heard stories that were part of the scenario. The story, Exiled from the Scenario, has become known. He is too strong. Exile him from this scenario. Use every means possible to send him to another world. I watched the passing history and felt anger, sadness, joy and frustration, just like Chiak Jungyang. After the bout of emotional feelings, Chiak Jungyang's face and solid body were seen. I had never seen Chiak Jungyang before, but I seemed to know him better than anyone else. This story was Chiak Jungyang. Why are you going so far to help me? Who knows? Why? 5 constellations on the Ganpyeongui were consumed in exchange for summoning Chiak Jungyang. However, the thing he was doing for me now far surpassed 5 constellations. No constellation would disclose the base of his story to an incarnation. In addition, Chiak Jungyang wasn't my sponsor. I was like you. One of Chiak Jungyang's stories flowed into my head. The story "One who fights against fate" has become known. Place fate on him. This person has to die. The words of the constellation struck me. I knew that Chiak Jungyang had been wronged. I didn't know he was affected by fate, just like me. A long time ago, Chiak Jungyang experienced the same thing due to the constellations. I saw the rising notification windows. The story "One who fights against fate" has begun. Chiak Jungyang's story was my story. Chiak Jungyang laughed. It isn't the same size as your fate. There was only one nebula who did this damn thing to me. Chiak Jungyang spoke as he watched the world through my eyes. At that time, I survived with the help of Hongik. However, I still often think about it. I shouldn't have received the help of any nebulae. Chiak Jungyang's spirit emerged from my chest. That's why I want to help you. He raised the sword in my hand and took a specific posture. The outer god, who had almost swallowed the founder's mother, roared. Chiak Jungyang also pulled out all his aura. The unbroken faith in my hand was crying violently. A good sword. The sword shook as if in response to the remark. My magic power was reduced, like there was a bottomless pit, while particles of pure ether gathered in my sword. An ether blade that was over 10 meters in length was formed. I shook from the formidable power and tried not to lose focus. I will borrow it for a while. My body was completely possessed by Chiak Jungyang and I started to run with unbroken faith in my hands. It was an overload that I couldn't cope with, despite my overall stats being over level 100. The bones in my body creaked and the group exploded, forming a huge crater. I was confident that I could cut anything with this power. However, I was engulfed in a sense of despair as soon as I leapt into the void and confirmed the enemy. It was an emotion I felt while living in the human world. Could I kill such a huge thing? The outer god beyond the great hole exceeded imagination just from the size. The diameter of the body alone was at least 1 kilometer. Each of the 12 legs attached to the body had a diameter of several dozens of meters. Still, not even 1/5 of it had passed through yet. If all of this guy appeared, who the hell could kill it? Chiak Jungyang read my despair and laughed. I am Chiak Jungyang. It felt like the world was listening. Or it was a declaration to the entire star stream. The strongest military leader on the Korean peninsula. Then the sword moved. There was a moment when I didn't know what I was doing, despite being the one to do the action. It was the swordsmanship of Chiak Jungyang. Two-sword style, two-sword mountain chop. Chiak Jungyang's sword moved. It wasn't a sword for cutting humans. It wasn't a sword for cutting monsters. It was a sword to cut nature. The blade that was over 10 meters moved twice in succession. This was a giant cracking sound. It looked more like darkness was flowing than blood, and looking closer, the darkness seemed like printed letters. I recognized it as the story of the outer god. In a way, the outer god was the same type of existence as the constellations. Along with a scream, the god's tentacles were separated from the torso and fell to the ground. It was like a huge building was falling. The astonished incarnations evacuated in all directions while I was surprised in another sense. A human could cut something like this. I felt awe for a being who was born a human but went beyond humans. However, a terrible pain came after the amazement. Hik, ku. I started groaning from the terrible pain. A violent storm was battering my body. I shivered like a person electrocuted by hundreds of thousands of volts. The bones in the hand that swung the sword were destroyed and my mind shriveled like a crushed bug. Strong power came with great responsibility, and in this world, the name of this responsibility was probability. Still, I wasn't ready to take responsibility yet. The constellation, Goryo's first sword, is looking at you. Chiak Jungyang was sharing the probability, but I was still too weak to handle his strength. Chiak Jungyang sighed. Weaker than I thought. I thought you could afford this much because you are a constellation. I wanted to say that he had too much brute strength, but my words didn't emerge. Cough. Pant. 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 Instead of throwing up food, I threw up electricity. I sat on the ground and breathed out for a few minutes before I barely managed to escape the probability storm. I looked up and saw the scene made by Chiak Jungyang. The sword that cut mountains. Chiak Jungyang had turned 2 of the 12 tentacles into rags from the one attack. In other words, he cut 2 mountains. However, there were 10 mountains and the torso remaining. Chiak Jungyang's voice was dark. It is insufficient. It might be possible if I could use more 3 swords. There are more than 3 swords. I haven't used it yet, but in your situation, I doubt I can even use 3 swords. I gritted my teeth. The summoning speed of the outer god was accelerating. Even if the scale of probability had been almost adjusted, the summoning continued and it seemed furious from the blow. Is there any way to negotiate with that guy? Negotiate? How will you negotiate with it? It is also a god. Chiak Jungyang noticed my intentions and interrupted me. If you are trying to save your mother, give up. It is a situation where the shadow of Founder's mother is eaten. Your mother's soul would already be scattered. It hasn't happened yet. The outer god doesn't eat its prey that way. It sounds like you are aware of the outer gods. Chiak Jungyang didn't know. I really did know the outer god. I once again looked at its appearance. The 2 giant tentacles and body were covered in a thick fog, making it not visible. The body, that was reminiscent to a giant canal, provoked cosmic awe just seeing it. There was no doubt. The Yu Junghyuk of the 136th regression fought against this very god. In fact, while I was sitting down and trying to breathe, Yu Junghyuk was fighting against another tentacle. By using the power of transcendence along with giant body transformation, Yu Junghyuk looked like a half-god who had descended. The power of breaking the sky sword moved over a tentacle and it shook painfully. Using his own strength, Yu Junghyuk damaged the outer god. The level was still insignificant compared to Chiak Jungyang, but Chiak Jungyang spoke in an admiring voice. This reminds me of me in my prime. With this type of talent, he might be able to catch up with me after a long time. Yu Junghyuk avoided the moving tentacles and cut off 1/3 of a tentacle. However, there was a limit to the blow he could deal. Yu Junghyuk stepped back and gasped. Kim Dokja, this guy is the devourer of dreams. I met him in the 2nd regression. Once eaten by him, you will live in his space for the rest of your life and have your stories extracted. You must never enter his mouth. It was information I already knew, but I nodded anyway. As Yu Junghyuk and I was recuperating, the summoning of the god kept accelerating. Now almost 1/3 of his body was summoned. The summoned tentacles started to riot and the landscape hundreds of meters around them were completely devastated. Some incarnations screamed as they were hit by the tentacles. The devourer of dreams wasn't a great old one, but it was still a cosmic god. The stories from Earth couldn't deal with it unless they joined forces. Chiak Jungyang spoke in a dark voice. If he fully descends, it isn't possible even with my strength. We have to attack now. However, the situation wasn't advantageous to us at all. Sparks flew as soon as Chiak Jungyang pulled up his story again, crushing my heart. This damn probability doesn't help at all. This was all the probability I could use, despite the outer god being summoned. The meaning of this was simple. Someone had assigned the amount of probability that could be used to us. It was stupid to ask who was behind this. I bit my lips and blood flowed down. We still need to do it. Use the three-sword style. Your presence might disappear if I use it. This is the only chance. Yu Junghyuk. Join forces with me this time. Yu Junghyuk nodded. I once again started running with unbroken faith in my hand. The sparks of probability flew with every step that I took. Would it be possible? I didn't know. This time I might really be crushed by the probability storm. Still, I had to do it. I had always done it and it would be the same again. Kuhik. Before I could even run 10 steps, the probability grabbed onto my ankle again. This time, the recoil was greater. As expected, it was impossible alone. I needed someone's help, but who could help me now? It was different from the time with the Absolute Throne. The constellations who tried to help me now would become enemies with the huge nebulae. The constellation, Maritime War God, is looking at you. The amount of sparks around me were gradually decreasing. The Duke of Loyalty and Warfare, Yi Sun-sin. He led the historical grade constellations of the Korean Peninsula and contributed to my probability. Chiak Jungyang was slightly touched. Duke of Loyalty and Warfare. There was a story that you are more likely to become a narrative grade than me. The constellation, Maritime War God, is nodding lightly. Well, okay. The stories added, are there any more? Are there no more constellations courageous enough to confront this god? The sky was silent. Apart from the Duke of Loyalty and Warfare, no one else took on my probability. Then Chiak Jungyang's angry roar emerged. Baldy! Come quickly and help. Aren't you someone who fights for justice? The constellation Bald General of Justice bows his head. Fucking one-eyed jerk, what are you doing? The constellation One-Eyed Maithreya is tightly holding his eye patch. Chiak Jungyang shouted towards the world, without worrying about his probability being wasted and his status being damaged. All of you are hiding even in this situation. Aren't you constellations? General? Maithreya? King? You don't deserve to be called this. Constellations of the Korean Peninsula are silent at the words of Goryeo first sword. Yet there still weren't any constellations who moved. At this moment, a figure staggered in the distance. The woman breathed roughly as she reached out to this side. It was Min Jaiwan. Fortunately, she was alive. The constellation Slumbering Lady of Fine Brocade is looking at you. Then a message was heard. Constellations of Scylla are bearing your probability together. The constellations of Scylla were helping me. It was a modest level of help, but they were still constellations. The nebula Vedas feels resentment towards Slumbering Lady of Fine Brocade. The constellation Slumbering Lady of Fine Brocade is exhausted from the excessive probability and has fallen into a deep sleep. A constellation closing their eyes meant they had suffered significant damage to their existence. Even so, the will of Slumbering Lady of Fine Brocade seemed to have affected the other constellations of the Korean Peninsula. I felt a prickling sensation as eyes started to gather on me. The constellation Bald General of Justice says he doesn't care and is looking at you. It started with Samyangdang. The constellation One-Eyed Maithreya is looking at you with half an eye. The constellation King Hungmu the Great is swearing as he looks at you. The constellation First Spiritualist of Joseon sighs and looks at you. The sparks covering me dwindled in an instant. It was finally turning into a likely probability. The nebula Olympus declares that Maritime War God is an enemy. The nebula Papyrus is furious at the constellations of the Korean peninsula. Thanks to me, the whole Korean peninsula was covered with war clouds. Cheok Jungyeong laughed. This is why I curse this land, but I can't leave. Fighting to the death with a few people. The minimum of preparations is reached. Finally, Cheok Jungyeong prepared his three-sword style. I'll see you Monday.